By the summer of 1945, American factories had produced more fighter aircraft than any nation in history had ever built for a single conflict, well over 100,000 machines across a dozen distinct types, from the sleek P-51 Mustang to the gull-winged F-4U Corsair. It was an industrial achievement almost impossible to grasp, fighters rolling off assembly lines at a rate of hundreds per week, each one engineered to kill and built to last for years of combat. And then, within 18 months of victory, the United States government quietly destroyed most of them. Not in battle and not to an enemy. Many were melted down by their own government, reduced to ingots of aluminum on American soil, some without ever having fired a shot. The irony at the heart of this story is difficult to overstate. Aircraft that had cost the equivalent of a small house to build were sold for the price of a used car. And within 5 years, the very Air Force that scrapped them would find itself desperately searching for any fighter still capable of flying. How does a nation build the most powerful fighter force on Earth and then dismantle nearly all of it within a handful of years? The scale of American fighter production during the war defies easy comparison. North American aviation alone built more than 15,000 P-51 Mustangs. Republic Aviation turned out roughly 15,600 P-47 Thunderbolts, the heaviest single-engine fighter of the war. Lockheed produced close to 10,000 of the distinctive twin-engine P-38 Lightning. Grumman delivered over 12,000 F-6F Hellcats to the Navy, while Chance Vought built a comparable number of F-4U Corsairs. Add the earlier P-40 Warhawks, the P-39 Airacobras, and a dozen lesser types, and the United States had manufactured well over 100,000 fighter aircraft in less than 4 years, a figure that still represents the largest fighter production run any single country has ever undertaken. For comparison, that single category of American military hardware outnumbered the combined fighter strength that Britain, Germany, and Japan were able to field at any single point during the conflict. By the time Japan surrendered in September 1945, the Army, Air Forces, and the Navy together held tens of thousands of these machines on hand, scattered across bases in the Pacific, Europe, and the continental United States, with thousands more still rolling off assembly lines under contracts that had not yet been canceled. A single Mustang had cost the government somewhere in the neighborhood of $50,000 wartime dollars, a sum equivalent to well over $500,000 today, while a twin-engine Lightning, more complex to build, ran closer to $90,000. The peacetime military that emerged from demobilization had neither the budget nor the manpower to maintain a fraction of that fleet. Pilots were being discharged by the hundreds of thousands, skilled mechanics were returning to civilian trades, and the Defense Budget Congress was prepared to approve for 1946 represented only a small fraction of wartime spending. Washington faced a problem that was, in its own way, as urgent as anything the war itself had produced. An air force several times larger than the nation could afford to keep, built from machines that began losing value the moment the shooting stopped. The agency tasked with solving it was the War Assets Administration, working alongside the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, both of which had been created specifically to liquidate the government's enormous surplus of wartime material. Aircraft considered for retention were flown to consolidation points, while everything else was funneled toward a small number of massive storage depots built almost overnight to absorb the flood. Kingman Army Airfield in the Arizona desert became one of the largest of these sites, holding, at its peak in early 1946, several thousand fighters and bombers parked wingtip to wingtip across the dry lakebed terrain that made the location ideal for long-term storage, since the arid climate slowed corrosion and the flat, treeless ground could accommodate row after row of parked aircraft stretching for miles. Walnut Ridge in Arkansas served a similar function for the Navy, receiving Hellcats, Corsairs, and Avengers by the hundreds, while Clinton, Oklahoma, and Ontario, California, filled comparable roles on a smaller scale. A depot near Albuquerque processed aircraft pulled from bases across the Pacific, and similar holding yards appeared at Marana and Davis-Monthan in Arizona, the latter of which would, decades later, become the permanent home of the military's modern aircraft boneyard. Local newspapers at the time occasionally ran photographs of these endless rows under headlines marveling at the sheer size of the gathering, with little sense yet of how quickly the rows would empty. Photographs from these sites in 1946 show rows of fighters stretching toward the horizon, their paint already beginning to bleach under the desert sun, propellers still attached, cockpits still intact, waiting for a decision that had, in most cases, already been made before the aircraft ever arrived. That decision was scrapping, and it proceeded with an efficiency that mirrored the speed of wartime production itself. Contractors who won government bids paid only a fraction of an aircraft's original cost, often calculated purely by the weight of recoverable aluminum rather than by any military or historical value. At Kingman, a company that had previously specialized in unrelated salvage work, brought in a mechanical guillotine capable of severing a fighter's wings and tail from its fuselage in a matter of seconds. Workers stripped engines, instruments, and any usable components first, then fed what remained into the blade before the wreckage went into a furnace and emerged as standardized ingots stacked on pallets for shipment to industrial buyers. Scrap aluminum during this period sold for only a handful of cents per pound, which meant a Mustang that had cost $50,000 to build might yield scrap revenue measured in the hundreds, occasionally less than the cost of the gasoline needed to fly it to the depot in the first place. The economics left no room for sentiment, and contracts were typically awarded to whichever bidder promised to clear the largest number of airframes in the shortest time, with no provision at all for setting aside historically significant examples. An aircraft that had escorted bombers over Berlin or covered Marines on Okinawa was, in the eyes of the disposal contracts, simply a few thousand pounds of metal awaiting processing. If you are finding this look at America's vanished fighter fleet interesting, this channel covers stories like it regularly, and subscribing means you will not miss the next one. The Soviet Union presents a separate and somewhat stranger chapter of the same disposal story. Under Lend-Lease, the United States had supplied the Red Air Force with nearly 5,000 P-39 Airacobras and several hundred P-63 King Cobras, flown across the brutal Alaska-Siberia ferry route by crews who battled weather as dangerous as any enemy they would later face in combat. Soviet pilots prized the Airacobra for its cannon armament and low-altitude performance, and several of the war's highest-scoring Soviet aces flew it almost exclusively, racking up kill tallies that rivaled anything achieved in American or British cockpits. When the war ended, Moscow treated the question of returning this equipment with the same indifference it showed toward Lend-Lease tanks. Most of the surviving aircraft were simply absorbed into Soviet inventories, stripped for parts, or scrapped on Soviet soil without any accounting back to Washington, a quiet diplomatic friction point that compounded the larger disagreements already emerging between the wartime allies. Overseas, the disposal took a different but equally final form. Under the terms of Lend-Lease, aircraft supplied to Britain were, in many cases, contractually required to be destroyed rather than resold into a commercial market that might compete with American manufacturers rebuilding for peacetime trade. At the enormous depot in Buttonwood, England, hundreds of fighters that had flown combat missions over occupied Europe were bulldozed, burned, or crushed rather than shipped home or transferred onward, their engines and instruments sometimes salvaged first but their airframes reduced to scrap on British soil. In the Pacific, the logistics were harsher still. Aircraft scattered across island airfields from the Philippines to the Marianas faced a simple calculation. The cost of recovering and shipping a fighter across thousands of miles of ocean almost always exceeded what the aircraft was worth as scrap, let alone as a weapon nobody needed anymore. On islands including Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, fighters that had only recently flown combat sorties were pushed off cliffs into the sea or bulldozed into pits and buried where they sat, sometimes still carrying live ammunition or fuel. Decades later, divers exploring the clear water off several of these islands would rediscover entire clusters of Corsairs and Hellcats resting on the seabed, their airframes remarkably preserved by the cold, low-oxygen depths, an underwater museum nobody had intended to create. A smaller but historically significant fraction of the surplus fleet escaped this fate through civilian sale. The War Assets Administration offered aircraft to the public at prices that, in hindsight, seem almost absurd, sometimes a few $100s for a fully functional fighter, occasionally less for aircraft considered less desirable or already partially stripped. Most buyers were not preservationists in any modern sense. Some were air racers drawn to the speed of a stripped-down Mustang or Bearcat, machines that would go on to dominate the unlimited class at the Reno air races for decades, their wartime armor and equipment torn out to shave every possible pound and squeeze a few extra miles per hour from engines never designed to be pushed quite that hard. Others were aerial survey operators or agricultural contractors looking for a cheap, powerful airframe to adapt for civilian work, while a few enterprising buyers purchased fighters specifically to resell them to Hollywood studios eager for authentic aircraft in war pictures. A handful of buyers were simply enthusiasts and former pilots unwilling to watch their wartime mounts disappear into a furnace. Men who scraped together a few $100s specifically to keep one example flying. None of these buyers could have known that the machines they were purchasing for the price of a car would one day be worth more than most houses, but their decisions, almost accidental in nature, are the reason any of these aircraft survive in flying condition today. The full weight of the disposal program's short-sightedness became apparent within 5 years. And this is where the irony, the opening of this story promised, finally arrives in full. When North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel in June 1950, the United States Air Force, newly independent and reorganized around jet aircraft, discovered that its early jets, the F-80 Shooting Star chief among them, lacked the range and loiter time to provide sustained close air support over the Korean peninsula's mountainous terrain. What the campaign needed was a propeller-driven fighter capable of carrying a heavy bomb load and staying over the battlefield for extended periods, precisely the role the P-51, now redesignated the F-51, had filled so effectively in Europe 5 years earlier. The problem was that the Air Force had scrapped or sold off the overwhelming majority of its Mustang fleet. Emergency programs scrambled to recall F-51s from Air National Guard units across the country, pulling aircraft out of training squadrons and storage facilities that had been scheduled for retirement, while mechanics worked around-the-clock reconditioning engines that had sat idle for years. In a detail that still strikes historians as almost too fitting to be true, American officials in at least one documented case found themselves negotiating to reacquire Mustangs from a foreign air force that had received them through earlier assistance programs, effectively buying back, at considerable expense, aircraft the United States had given away or scrapped for a fraction of their value only a few years before. Entire squadrons of F-51s were shipped to Korea within weeks, their pilots often more familiar with jets and forced to relearn propeller-driven combat tactics on the way to the front. The fighters that had been worth less than a used automobile in 1946 were, by the winter of 1950, irreplaceable assets that pilots were once again flying into combat over a different Asian peninsula, a reversal so complete that procurement officers who had overseen the scrapping program 5 years earlier were, in some cases, the same men now signing orders to find any airworthy Mustang the country had left. That reversal also explains why so few of these aircraft exist today, and why the ones that do survive command extraordinary prices. Of more than 15,000 Mustangs built, historians estimate that fewer than 300 remain in any form, and only a small fraction of those are airworthy. The P-38 Lightning fared worse still. Its twin-engine complexity made it expensive to maintain and unattractive to civilian buyers compared to simpler single-engine types. And today, perhaps 24 examples remain capable of flight anywhere in the world, out of nearly 10,000 originally produced. A flying, combat veteran Mustang today routinely sells for well over $2 million at auction. A genuinely rare variant, or one with documented wartime history, can exceed $4 million. The aircraft that scrap contractors once weighed by the pound, paying out a sum that barely covered the labor of cutting them apart, are now appraised, quite literally, by the gram of original wartime metal they still contain. The story of these fighters did not end with their destruction or their survival. It continued in the factories that had built them. North American Aviation, Republic, Grumman, and the other manufacturers that had mass-produced fighters by the thousand turned their wartime expertise towards civilian aviation, refrigeration, and a booming post-war consumer economy hungry for aluminum, precision manufacturing, and the disciplined production techniques the war had forced into existence. The same melted-down ingots that had once been wings and fuselages became kitchenware, lawn furniture, and the early skeletons of the commercial airliners that would define the jet age, an almost literal recycling of the tools of war into the comforts of peace. Engineers who had spent 4 years solving problems of speed, armor, and firepower now applied identical discipline to solving problems of cost, durability, and mass appeal for an American public eager to spend money it had been unable to spend during the war years. The engineers and assembly line workers who had built fighters under wartime urgency carried that knowledge into the industries that shaped the next several decades of American manufacturing, and the production line methods perfected at North American's Inglewood plant or Republic's Farmingdale facility quietly became the template for post-war mass manufacturing far beyond aviation. Behind the numbers were people, and their stories deserve more than a footnote. Many of the riveters who assembled these aircraft were women who had never worked in a factory before the war began. Many of the pilots who flew them were barely out of their teens, trained in months rather than years, and sent into combat against enemies' flying machines built by industries with their own desperate urgency. Some of those pilots, years later, were the very buyers who rescued individual fighters from the scrapper's blade, men who had once flown these machines in anger and now wanted, simply, to keep one alive. They restored engines by hand, hunted for original parts in junkyards and farm sheds, and in doing so preserved not just an airframe but a piece of an industrial and human effort that no peacetime economy could ever recreate at the same scale. Some never found the aircraft they had flown specifically, and settled instead for any example of the type, content simply to sit in a cockpit again and remember. A war had needed winning, and it was won. Then peace needed paying for, and the fighters paid for it, one ingot at a time. The men who had trusted these machines with their lives could only watch, in most cases from a distance, as that payment was made. What survives today, parked outside small-town airports or rolled out for summer airshows, painted in the colors of squadrons that fought over Normandy or the Solomon Islands, represents perhaps 0.5% of what once existed. The rest is gone, melted into the post-war world it helped create, or resting quietly on the floor of an ocean it once patrolled from above. Every restored Mustang that taxis out for an airshow today is, in a very literal sense, a survivor twice over, once of combat and once of the disposal program that very nearly finished the job the enemy could not. The next time one roars overhead at a summer airshow, the sound is not just nostalgia. It is the sound of an aircraft that, by every reasonable expectation of 1946, should not still exist. If the story of America's vanished tank fleet left you wondering what happened to the rest of the hardware that won the war, the fate of the wartime Navy's aircraft carriers follows an almost identical pattern of triumph, neglect, and unexpected revival, and that story is waiting next. If this video gave you something worth knowing, subscribing helps more of these stories find their way to you, and a thumbs up tells the channel it is on the right track. Thanks for watching.